Okay, so welcome everybody to this POPLmark Challenge 15 Years On panel. So I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this panel. I'm Michael Hicks, and our distinguished panelists are Benjamin Pierce, Peter Sewell, Xavier Lois, Scott Owens, and Brigitte Pienka. And what we're going to do today is start the panel with some short remarks by Benjamin, looking back at what has happened, maybe more factually, since the POPLmark Challenge. And then we'll have a series of questions that we have put together based on feedback we received online to get the conversation started. And then we'll open the floor to more questions. And then after those things have died down or we run out of time, we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for some concluding remarks from each of the panelists. Benjamin?
Okay, so let's set the stage. Think way back to 2004. Some of you might not have been born yet. It was a long time ago. Was there CompCert? No. Was there SEL4? No. What there was some programming languages and some proof assistants. And the people that did programming languages sort of knew that there were proof assistants, and the people that did proof assistants sort of knew that there were programming languages because they had to use them to write their proof assistants. And there were a few people that would sort of swim back and forth, but it was a long way and some of them drowned. There were not too many. But things were happening in the world. One thing that was happening was that the people making the proof assistants were making them better and better. And the sort of cost of entry of using a proof assistant was getting better and better. At the same time, the sorts of proofs that one wanted to do, oh yay, we have another panelist. Sorry. Welcome. That's Rob. The perceived need for some kind of help with these gigantic proofs that we were starting to do was getting more and more urgent. If you look way back to the early days of POPL, the definition that you made the proofs about was half a page, and then the proofs were the rest of the paper. But by 2004, the definition was the first 4 pages of the paper, and then at the end it would say, and for the full definition, please see the 20-page appendix. And then it would say, for the proofs, see the 200-page tech report. And the chances of getting this right by hand were just getting smaller and smaller. So the curves crossed in about 2005. And people started to wonder on the programming languages side, which was the side that I was viewing it from, are proof assistants ready to handle my problems and help me with my work? And so some of us decided to find out. This was beginning to be a common question at that time. By issuing a challenge from the PL community sort of to the proof assistant community to say, here are some problems that we know we would like to be able to formalize because they're tricky to reason about. Not too tricky, but a little bit tricky. And would you please show us your best ideas of how we could do that? So a group of people, probably several of them are in the room. So I was one. Who else was there at the time? Steve, Peter, and Stephanie Weyrich, and a bunch of students, some of whom are no longer students, issued a challenge. It was published in the TP Hall's 2005 instance. Issued a challenge that read like this. It was a whole paper, but here was the abstract. It said, so it could be summarized as at the top, but here was the actual abstract. It said, how close are we to a world where every paper on programming languages is accompanied by an electronic appendix with a machine check proof? We propose a set of benchmarks. We were influenced by the spec benchmarks that were, of course, big at the time. For the hardware community, could we have a set of POPLmark benchmarks that would gauge progress in mechanization programming languagey things. So what were the things that we mechanized, or that we requested to be mechanized? There were sort of three categories. The whole thing was framed around this System F sub, which was a system that a lot of people liked to study at the time, which was basically System F with a subtyping relation. And the meta theory of System F is moderately tricky. It's something that you could really get wrong on paper. People had gotten it wrong on paper, but not huge. So paper proofs, so correct paper proofs were only a few pages long. We figured that was about the right size for a benchmark problem that we actually wanted people to try out. So the very first part was just about the subtype relation and a particular proof that's quite tricky called transitivity of subtyping. And then there was a second part of what if you add records, so that there's a little bit of ... in the paper version, and requires a little more formalization effort. And then the second part, more challenging, a little more challenging, was formalizing the whole calculus, the operational semantics and type safety, and then maybe adding in a little bit of extra variable binding stuff. And then there was a third part that was a little squishier, but that, as I recall, we really had Peter to thank for introducing these issues, was asking questions about, like, how easy to use is your formalization for doing things like running it to animate example programs, or using it for automated testing. How easy is it to extract algorithms from the semantics that you write down and run them? So, so this was the challenge. It was published as a kind of funny sort of paper in this theorem proving conference. And the result was a really gratifying response from the proof assistant side. A whole bunch of people tried to make their own solution, well, succeeded in making their own solutions, probably more tried. So this is the list of people that, that submitted at least one, in some cases more than one, solution, using a wide variety of proof assistants that were popular or not so popular at the time. A lot of these formalizations were cleaned up and documented, and eventually became a special issue of the Journal of Automated Reasoning, where you can find, I forget whether it's most or all, but anyway, a very large number of these turned into nicely documented studies in journal papers. And we can look a little bit at just some facts. So the core of the challenge, as we viewed it, was not just operational semantics and theorems about typing and things like that. It was how well did these proof assistants deal with some of the trickier challenges like variable binding that was already known at that time to be kind of an annoying, long-standing problem in formalizing programming languages. So, the sorts of solutions to variable binding that people had were many, so let's see. There was one alpha prolog solution that used a nominal presentation of variable bindings. There were a whole bunch of Coq solutions that used all sorts of different presentations of variable binding. There was a 12th one and an ATS one and a couple of Isabelle ones. Tita, Abella. So great variety in both proof assistants and approaches. And that was what happened in 2005 and the ensuing 2004 and the ensuing couple of years. It's interesting then to kind of roll forward and look at what happened in the intervening period and some of the differences between where we were then and where we are now. I apologize for these very tiny numbers. Can we even see them at all? No, but we can see these. So thank you very much to Talia and Tej for helping put together these numbers on short notice. This is a little bit hard to interpret, I apologize. But we took a few snapshots of who was using mechanization for specifically POPL in 2009, in 2014, and then in, sorry, they're out of order, 2018, 2019, 2020. And one thing that's interesting is, so I think 2009 was already enough past the 2004 issuing of the POPL Mark Challenge that people were starting to get into the act. And so 12 out of 159 submissions were fully verified, and 30 more were machine assisted in some way. So that's if you add all those together, it's a not too small percentage. In 2014, Peter estimated that around 10% of the submissions were completely formalized and a little bit more partially formalized, so maybe not too different from 2009 to 2014. If you look at 2018, 19, 20, it's creeping up more in the 25% range. So kind of steady over the years. But one thing to point out is that it's not just POPL. There are other conferences springing up, like CPP, which this year received 72 submissions, presumably all of which were formalized in some way. I don't actually have numbers about that, but at least a very great number of them were formalized in some way, and at least 27 of them were formalized in a good way. Okay, so we've seen an increasing use of proof assistance in the PL community, and I think increasing interchange between the communities is super clear. I want to touch on some potential or even actual downsides and disappointments of the whole encroaching of proof assistance. We used to say back in the 2000s that it was going to be great when the POPL Mark Challenge really took over, because being a POPL PC member was going to be completely easy. All you would have to do is open each paper, read the introduction, decide if you thought it was interesting, and then put it in the accept pile or the reject pile, because you wouldn't need to check the proofs. And anyway, there would only be 13 submissions, because everybody else would still be trying to get to QED. So did that happen? I think the previous numbers showed that we didn't quite get to that state. That's probably good. Let's see. Is this slide what I wanted? Yes. So, so did we get what we wanted from this exercise? I think the main thing we wanted was to bring the communities together and to find out whether proof assistants were fun to use for ourselves. And I think both of those things happened. So, so in that sense, yes, the experiment was a success. And I think contributed to what would probably anyway have been a growing convergence of these areas and a growing amount of crossover. But then more specifically, did we get what we technically wanted out of this? In particular, did we find out how to formalize variable binding? And I would say sort of no, or another way to say it could be what we found out over the years was it's pretty hard, and indeed good old de Bruijn indices, which are annoying but kind of do the job and don't get you involved in too many theoretical puzzles, seem to actually be winning out. At least this was Stephanie's impression. I regard her as probably the world expert on variable binding in theorem provers these days, certainly around Penn, and she thinks de Bruijn is probably winning, although she likes locally nameless. And I would say the third squishy part of what we wanted in the original challenge maybe hasn't happened as much as we wanted. And then another question we could ask is, have there been any negative effects? And some people were worried at the time, maybe are still worried, that, that we are implicitly suggesting that a mechanized submission is a better submission than a non-mechanized one, and we should only have those. That wasn't the intention, but, and I think hasn't happened. But what I think has happened is partially mechanized submissions are viewed much worse than they used to be. So, getting 95% of the way through formalizing a complicated thing is a sure way to get your paper rejected these days. Okay, so I want to turn it over to more interesting people, but here is my picture of the world in 2020. There's still 2 different continents, but there's lots of bridges and boats going back and forth and so on, and people enjoying swimming in the water. A great amount of productive crosstalk between the 2 communities and people that really inhabit both. That's a very good thing, I think, on both sides. And the main question that I would love to see some hints come out from this panel and the rest of the next little while is what's next.
Okay, great. Okay, so then my next question is, in your estimation, what are the things that made POPLMark a successful benchmark, and maybe in what ways was it lacking? From maybe the answer to that question, were there any tangible outcomes and changes to technology that you can draw a line to from those successes, or maybe a lack of change due to the failures? And do you think there are any winners and losers that sort of came about as a result of POPLMark? Peter?
Okay, so there are several things to say to that. I think it was a success and a failure in some sense for the same reason. So it was a small enough benchmark and kind of cute enough that it was quite appealing for people to do. I mean, we had a bunch of solutions. We were all, as Xavier described, lots of people were fired up to do this in their favorite way and explore. So that was, and that also made the solutions sort of comparable by eyeballing them. I mean, that's the most you can expect to get from this. But that focus on a proving meta theory of a small calculus, I think meant that we never really directed attention towards doing semantics for real languages, and especially the fact that we didn't succeed in getting this part 3 sort of execution thing going meant that we didn't start connecting to implementations of languages in any serious way. So I don't know how we could have done that better then, but we failed to do that. Oh, one more negative effect. So Adam and Benjamin and all of this improved exposition about how to use Coq was great, but that has also come at some expense of mindshare for the other major provers, and some of those are really good too.
Anyone else?
Okay, so yeah, I think, well, the great success, I mean, I think it was a great success as evidenced by the excitement among the community, and it was quite a challenge. It was hard, which also pushed a number of people to be competitive and try to solve that puzzle before the other groups. So that was fun. There was a little bit of an ICFP Warming contest feeling to it. Maybe what I miss most is actually some kind of conclusion. I mean, if a student comes and sees me and to ask, well, I would like to formalize this functional language, what method should I use? I'm not quite sure what to say. Okay, let's go over to the chart with the 6 different styles and the 5 different proof assistants, and let's see where you want to be in there. So yeah, that's a little bit a slight disappointment. And what's lacking? So I agree. With Peter, I would have liked to see maybe a little more about executable things and algorithms, not just specifications, but also algorithms. And because, well, first of all, when I prove compilers, I like to prove algorithms and even actual natural functions that will transform my programs. And also, I think when you take algorithmic complexity into account, most of the advanced binding representations fail, okay, because they cause quadratic blow-up, like HOAS or locally nameless, because at every binder you need to refresh what's under, okay, and that takes linear time. So your whole traversal is now n square. And it's really humbling that the only algorithmically efficient traversals I know are for the brain or named without alpha conversion. Okay. And that really makes me scratch my head.
Anyone else? Outcomes, winners and losers? Ways PoppleMark could have been better? Awesome. All right, so the next question is, speaking about Benjamin's last slide, what next? What should PoppleMark 2020 look like? What are the problems, perhaps? We just heard one that were unaddressed in the original PoppleMark that still are to be addressed that a new benchmark might challenge. What new problems are now in the fore that maybe weren't in 2005? Are there different ways, perhaps styles of benchmark, ways of testing it that the new PoppleMark might have? I wonder if you have thoughts about that. Robbie, you haven't had a chance to speak. I know you've worked on REDX and other tools. I wonder if you have any thoughts about what we should do next to challenge things.
Thanks, Mike, and sorry for being late. I think that that as a community we have, at the risk of being perhaps overly grandiose in my words, an inclusion, a problem of equity in the way that we write papers and we communicate, attempt to communicate with others. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. Our papers are riddled with errors. Do you agree with that? You think that, I mean, I'm not saying that our papers are wrong. I think generally speaking our papers are right. You know, that when a published result it's actually true. But that's a very different thing from the presentation actually explaining the result in a way to somebody who can understand it, who is not, you know, say a Fell-Eisen student who can go knock on his door, which is what I was able to do when I was confused about a paper. And I would say like, oh, look at this judgment. It says here that, you know, there's this X here and it doesn't make any sense to me. That should be a Y, I think. And he would look at it and go, no, that's right, you're wrong. I'd be like, well, but I got it because I sort of copied this other rule over here and put the things in this place so that I would understand. And he's like, oh yeah, that rule has the typo. Yes, you're right. That rule should have been a W in this spot over here. And then I'd be like, oh, that's great. And I could work with the papers in this kind of environment that I had access to that maybe not everybody has access to. And so in that spirit, I think the right way to look at something like a PoppleMark is it's sort of an it's an instantiation or a specialization of how we might look at making our papers more robust in general and more approachable to lots of people. So it's good to know that your results are true, right? And that's what you get out of a theorem prover. And that's definitely a big step towards making sure that your paper has the correct thing, because I can go look at the Coq script or whatever it is that you've produced if I'm confused about the W's, the X's, or whatever, and see. But there's a lot of things in that general space about improving the quality of the paper itself beyond just getting the mechanized, the proof right. And that's sort of what some of this running examples is about, I think. And that's certainly what motivates REDX. So I think the right way to look forward to a next version 2 of something like PoppleMark would be to see if we can't help build tools to help people write papers that communicate more effectively. And I mean that in a very broad sense. So like QuickCheck is, I think, a fantastic example. Leo's work. These two guys know him better, and maybe could pronounce his last name for you. Okay, good, you all know him.
Lampropoulos.
Thank you, Lampropoulos. Okay, you know, that's a fantastic example of this, I think. there's this guy, Matt Kay, who's in visualization, and he's like, there's lots of statistical methods you could choose to evaluate, you know, this user study that we're doing. And so my paper actually has all of them in it, and you kind of push this button and the paper like kind of animates. It's not a PDF, and you get to see what you know, whether the student t-test comes out with this way or some other statistical analysis that you think is the right one that should have been done. You can sort of flip through and get to that one for the paper too. And so there's lots of ways I think that we can look at this more, I think, important, broad question than just am I really good at playing video games kind of approach to guaranteeing high quality papers. All right, I've talked for a long time. That's my thoughts.
Thank you. I wonder, so that, you spoke a bit to the, what we should have, or maybe how we should evaluate things rather than just, you know, true, not true. What are the other things that are important that these tools can assist with? I wonder if we could also speculate about what should be the topics of the challenges themselves. Birgit, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
So I think clearly there were some areas that weren't really tackled by POPLMark itself. It focused very heavily on binding, and the structure of the proof was basically inductive proof. It had, you know, lexicographic ordering, but it was essentially a syntactic proof, like similar to a syntactic type soundness proof. And so there are many kinds of proofs we do in this community that don't fall into that domain. So if you think about state and concurrency, that's a completely distinct domain. Depending on what languages you work with, maybe binding is actually not that important. Similarly, if you go back to sort of some of the questions that were very important to the theorem proving community, so for example, proving cock in cock or verifying acta in acta. So proofs about these systems themselves to make them more trustworthy. The proof methods that were tested in POPLMark, they're not sufficient. We need these kinds of proofs which are relying on logical relations, and these are logical relations proofs that have to deal with terms that make sense in a typed context. And these proofs are somewhat different than logical relations proofs you might do about state, where you have to reason about the development or evolution of state. So I think it's worthwhile sort of crafting specific problems from these domains. And I think actually one of the reasons, I mean, it was mentioned that why was POPLMark so successful? It was actually a small problem. It was easy to read. There was a chapter in Benjamin Pierce's book, so every grad student could actually read it. You could tackle it. You could use it as a way of learning something about system of sub, but you could also use it as a way of learning something about Coq or Isabelle or 12, or maybe a particular encoding technique you encountered. And I think that was one of the reasons people were drawn into it. And if you think about how you debug systems, you're also not dumping them, the whole compiler, here's my bug. You would carve out a specific problem in your overall software you were writing and then send your bug report. And so in the same way, I think these benchmarks should be sort of carving out a particular subproblem that can highlight what's the challenge if I reason about concurrency, what is the challenge that I reason about state, what is the challenge if I try to do a proof that aims to eventually do something about a full type theory.
Thank you.
So we're encouraged here to be controversial. So let me disagree strongly with that.
Thank you. That's why I said it.
Not that those are not good things to do and good kinds of challenge, but the thing which I think we are most missing, which is also something which is particularly hard to have as a challenge, is a focus on tools and techniques that actually deal with scale, with full-scale language designs, and with tooling integration so that you can actually parse terms and talk about them in the prover and do the testing and execution. How to stimulate people to do anything like that in any kind of comparable way is very tough. But I think that is the thing that we have most missed in these last scary number of years. It's quite disturbing how few of our major beautiful functional languages have definitions.
Okay.
but, do you want to respond to Peter? Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to make one comment. So I actually agree that I think scale is important. But I think I think this is how we normally design benchmarks. Right? If you think about benchmarks for compilers or even theorem proving, if you look at the 1,000 problems in theorem proving, there are large problems, and they take a certain amount of time, and then you measure the success by how quickly something was proven. And for 1,000 problems in theorem proving, essentially, is it proving it correctly or disproving it, and how long it took. And if you think about how you measure, let's say static analysis tools or compilers, you measure performance. You have a set of benchmarks, you run them, and then you say, hey, my technique is better because now I use less time, for example. But the problem with using interactive theorem provers is that they're interactive. And so there is a human component in this. And that, I think, is the challenge. You have to engage the human in order to do actually that challenge. And so while I agree we should also think about what does it take to scale some of these things, it's, in my opinion, somewhat unrealistic to ask, can we do CompCert also in Isabelle just to compare? Because it would take a lot of time.
You have 1 week.
So,
So Peter and Birgitta were channeling some of what I was also thinking. Scale is clearly one of the next big frontiers, and the fact that there are humans in the loop makes that really difficult. With the spec benchmarks and things like that, people complain about them, but some of the benchmarks that are in there are pretty big, and they can be because the amount of time that you spend running your test on them does not scale with the size of the benchmark. It scales with the work that you did on your actual tool. So we're in a bit different situation. But I wonder if there's maybe a middle ground somewhere, if there's room for, maybe somebody could do like a prove it, break it, fix it contest, where the goal would be you have a certain amount of time to build a proof of something, and then somebody changes the specification, and how quickly can you catch up, or something else unexpected happens, and now you have to adapt. So that would stress some aspect of scalability and maintainability. Might be fun. Adam would win.
Can I say a few things?
I was just going to say that I'm going to give Scott a chance to respond to this question, and also, if you can, to talk about the question of how maybe some of these challenges that we're seeing for PoppleMark, some of the things maybe it did right and could apply to other benchmarks. I know you've thought about that.
Yeah. And I agreed a lot with what Robbie was saying about presentation being very important, but I wanted to think about it from a slightly different point of view, a little bit more sort of low-level technical point of view, and say that, I've had the experience before of, and I'm not a Coq person at all, I can sort of muddle through reading the definitions if they're pretty simple. But I've had the misfortune to attempt to read papers before where they've mechanized everything, and all the definitions in the paper are just pretty much text TT, Coq source here, right? And that's not very good presentation, and that's something that I think, the tools that we're using to mechanize things support us in discerning the truth, but we also want the tools we use to mechanize things help us with the communication. One way they help us with the communication is that instead of writing a big appendix that no one will read, someone can just run our proof script and sort of believe that it's true. But I think sort of if the PoppleMark challenge had this sort of squishy third part to it about sort of animating things, and we haven't quite solved that yet, I think that any future PoppleMark challenge should have that, as the sort of a central thing that's sort of really hard. Can we solve the things Peter was talking about? So I'd like to propose sort of the new sort of squishy part of the not quite nailed down, but we should really be thinking about it, part of any future PoppleMark challenge should be about how can we present our formalism? You know, formalism also has often more detail than you want to have in the paper. You know, I've gone through and said, okay, well, here's my bill definition. Here's all the things I'm going to just hide from the user because it gets in the way of understanding. It's just there for the proof or the completist. So I think looking at how our tools can support us doing that is very important, even at the small scale. I mean, I can only dream that we come up with a way to where we can present our 100-page definitions of sort of Koch or Isabelle or whatever, and how we can present that in a nice way. I think that's a much harder question. So, I think I didn't answer everything you sort of asked me to
The other
answer,
thing that you could comment on, if you like, it would be how other benchmarks that might be developed in the future could learn from what Popplemark did right.
I don't know if I wanted to say maybe something a bit about maybe what it did wrong, or maybe how it just took advantage. It was in a really particular time and place. And I liked Benjamin's slide with the sort of swimming people. I think I was one of the swimming people because I was a PhD student at the time and was being influenced by sort of two different advisors from each side and was trying to sort of find which way I wanted to go. And so I think it really took advantage of that in that it said, here's a thing, solve it. And people took that as a license to explore many different dimensions, right? And so I think if you find you're in, other challenges, if you're in that space, that room for exploration is really great. I think now, for a future Popplemark challenge, we're in a different situation. We wouldn't want to do that again. You would want multiple challenges. The sort of, can you animate this? Can you really deal with the concrete syntax? Sort of part 3 of Popplemark. A challenge really focused on that. You might still want to have a naming challenge, but that might be something different than the challenge you want to set for, let's decide which theorem prover is the best theorem prover challenge. And I think also, Popplemark was sort of, we instantiated an existential quantifier, right? We said, this can be done. Now we need to sort of try to say, well, if I wanted to meta-analyze the meta theory for this, how much would it cost me to do this? Is it worth doing? Right, and that's a much more difficult question to answer. But it I think now becomes the more important one.
Great.
Briefly, one of the big effects of the Popplemark challenge in the years since is that people's pain thresholds have gone up. It's not at all clear to me that the tools have got easier to use, except with better documentation and exposition. But, well, people kind of expect it. It's not necessarily a good thing.
Foundations are good for you. Okay, so at this point I'd like to open the floor to the audience. We can take a bunch of questions from all of you, and curious what you think.
So I think Regina started off early talking about how this was once very much Koch and so forth were used in LIX and other conferences, and now Popple has become very central. Has been using a lot of us know the Koch and other theorem provers. Has Popplemark had an effect on, what kind of effect has it had on the other communities that might use theorem provers? And has it been positive, negative? Have we swallowed up the theorem prover community, or have we helped expand it? Wondering what you could say about that.
Who would like to answer?
Do we have any effect on mathematicians, the formalizing mathematicians? I don't think so.
Well, I think if you look at foundations for type theories, I think the bigger impact has come either following open questions that were still there independently of Popplemark. So, for example, there was this, the system 12. It was not clear how to formulate inductive proofs or how to add something like inductive definitions to these kind of high-order abstract text representations, and how to reason about them. And then there were certainly, the work I did on Beluga and the work which was done on Abella was kind of taking this line of work further. It had nothing really to do with POPLMark. I mean, we were able to do POPLMark before, and it was kind of, following sort of the questions that came out of this community itself. And I think the other part, you see a lot of the development happening on higher inductive types, for example, in ACTA, that comes out of the homotopy type theory. So people who are working on theoretical foundations of these systems, they're looking at other extensions, I would say. I would say that there has been some work, like AutoSubst, on trying to provide better tool support and coming up with a more principled way of arriving at your De Bruijn foundation. But in the end, you have to work with the De Bruijn encoding. So in some sense, what I wish would be that we kind of apply maybe the compilation approach we know works in programming languages, right? We work in a high-level language like ML, and then we compile it into a lower-level language, but we understand, even if we don't have any concrete data on this, we understand that we do not necessarily want to always write our programs in a C-like language or even lower level. And so what I'm curious is what this community could bring. With the same methods and tools, we know how to build programming languages. How could we bring these kind of benefits to proof assistance to provide a sort of a higher level way of communicating? I mean, that goes back to some of the things you're saying, but I think the fact that we're using De Bruijn, or what Peter was saying, the threshold has just gone up. We're okay with that, but I think especially programming language researchers have not been happy with that threshold of dealing with pain in the writing programs, and we know what the benefits are of having compilers for ordinary programming languages, so why are we not thinking about compilers for proof languages?
Yeah, I'm not sure this will really answer the question, but that's something that popped into my mind. I'm extremely impressed by the progress that has been made on program logics, pretty much since POPLMark. So maybe it's just a coincidence, but the concurrent separation logic was published around the same time, 2004, I think. And in this community and other communities interested both in axiomatic semantics and logics for programs, there have been a huge progress on very sophisticated concurrent separation logics. And I think some of those progress have been made possible only with machine assistance. I'm thinking of Iris, for instance, which is a clockwork, okay? But I don't think it could have been done on paper. Okay, so I think this is an area that really benefited from embracing the mechanized early approach.
This is obvious, but someone should mention the increasing prevalence of proof assistance in systems conferences. It's a little hard to know to what extent the fact that PL people were picking it up had a real effect there, or whether it would have happened anyway. But clearly the kind of increasing the wave that we've been riding in this community also extends to that community, and so it's become commonplace now to see mechanized developments appearing in SOSP, CCS, OSDI, and that's to me a kind of amazing and promising occurrence.
So an area that I think might have been mentioned briefly in the original POPLMark challenge was something about sort of modular proofs or proof reuse or things like that. And I think that would be a phenomenal sort of next step. Would be like in 5 years, like do none of us ever have to prove anything about substitution again, because we've got like reusable modules in Agda or even Coq that you just plug in for your you define your language. And boom, they just put there. And I like AutoSubst is like a good step in that direction. And I think there's other examples in Agda of similar kinds of things. And so that solves it for like substitution, but there's like a whole bunch of other proofs that we do, and then we do little variations on them over and over again and copy and paste and for different languages. And but it'd be awesome if we could just like instantiate modules and just do reuse of these, some of these theorems.
Sorry, so was there a question there? Was that?
That was your earlier thing about like what?
This is, yeah, oh, absolutely. You're throwing down the gauntlet.
Yeah.
Anyone like to comment on that?
It would indeed be awesome.
Dependent types hate abstraction.
Dependent types hate abstraction, and even a simpler place where you see that is the difficulty of making really nice reusable libraries, which I think is a problem in most proof-assistant ecosystems.
All of this is true for paper and pencil. We have to solve it there first.
And for software.
It's a little better for software.
Because we have had more time to think about it, I guess.
We still don't have definition reuse, except in specific contexts like the extended iris group and a few others.
I think one thing that would help if we use is if you would have more automation, then you wouldn't necessarily have to port the exact structure of the proof over. You would be happy to do the reproving, but if you have automation, it wouldn't cost you very much. So I think that's another thing that we're not very good at in many of these proof assistants. Automation is somewhat ad hoc. I think having a more principled way of doing automation would be a step forward.
I'm just going to inject my own opinion for a minute. So the things that you guys are saying about the human in the loop and how do you evaluate something where there's a person that's involved, automation hopefully takes the human out of the loop more often, but sometimes it totally doesn't because you change some small thing and now the proof doesn't terminate anymore, the automation doesn't terminate. I think it's really important in general for programming languages, all the people here, that we consider humans when we evaluate our programming languages in terms of their use. And the same thing, you guys are hitting on all of it, all of you are hitting on the same issue with proof assistants. And we're not so good at evaluating programming languages as far as their utility. Maybe that needs to be something that's part of just saying out loud what you've already been saying for proof assistants also. Sorry, there are other people that had their hand up. I'll get to you.
There were some comments about the availability of proof assistants making it easier to do convincing proofs of complex systems. Could this be sort of a perverse incentive structure that makes us want to build more complex systems instead of simple ones?
Actually, I can agree with you to some extent. So yeah, this is giving us a lot of power that made it possible to make proofs of unprecedented size. Okay, and Concert, I think, is one of the instances. He said, sometimes I think I don't want Concert to become any bigger, okay, and treat any more of the C language and so on, because it feels like it's just more of the same. And sometimes, because I'm also a teacher, I like to teach on IMP, a language with 4 constructs, and where you can already show and understand a lot of things. So sometimes, maybe I think we should also need to come back to simpler systems and look at them differently. So yeah, we can go to bigger systems. Maybe also we can get better ideas or crisp representation for simpler systems, and that's already good for discovery, for understanding, and for teaching.
Yeah, I think I'd like to break that down into 2 aspects. One is the real systems that people are building in the real world, and there I think the sort of engineering community, software engineering community's ability to make really complicated things at an alarming rate is still so far ahead of where we are with proof assistants that we don't need to worry about that. But there is a real question. I'll go back to presentation again. If I'm thinking of, if I've got my sort of KML formalization or whatever that needed to be practical and I put a lot of work into it, when I go to write a paper about that, I want to put all of that in. And I do have sort of in-array tuples and all sorts of constructs. And the theorem prover is what let me have those things and be confident that I've got them right. But maybe for presenting that to someone, that's too complicated of a system. And I think that's actually what you were saying about wanting to use imp to teach, not wanting to use POMSR to teach with, right? So I think that there we do have a real danger of that, because the reviewer can't quibble with your theorem because Coq says it's true. Doesn't mean that maybe the prover did let you overcomplicate things more than you needed to for this purpose of a presentation, if not for all purposes.
I wanted to ask what you all think about the relationship between interactive theorem provers and proof assistants and more automated theorem provers. And we've seen a whole lot of successful SMT solving since 2005. And what do you see as the relationship between those two sorts of lines of work?
So yeah, I think it's still kind of ongoing. I think at the CoQ workshop on Saturday we will have some news about Coq SMT. So this project of integrating SMT solver as statistics within Coq. So yes, there's obviously room for more automation in my Coq proofs. That's obvious. Now, the one thing that, again, there's something that is humbling, which is that basically the nicer the language, the logic, the more powerful the logic, the nicer the specification language, and the less automation we have, okay, of the SMT kind and so on. I mean, SMT is just first order logic. Some systems understand data types, constructors and injectivity of constructors, but not all of them. And just translating a problem from Coq to SMT, lib, or whatever, is already a major endeavor. Okay, and so I don't quite know what to do. Should I switch to a simpler logic to get more automation, or continue having an expressive logic and nice specification language and suffer doing proofs scripts by hand? I don't know.
Anyone else?
It makes me wonder if there's an important interoperability study, interoperability questions that we should be answering and looking at ways that we can, just like we do with programming languages, you know, any real programming system is going to have a gazillion languages, you know, everything from Perl and make files to all the way up. Maybe there's a role.
Yeah.
We can kind of connect different parts of the proof that work in different, yeah, I don't know.
Since Mike gave me cover, I would ask the question I've been sitting on for the whole panel. I believe PoppleMike has had a hugely negative impact on Popple. I have done my fair share of proofing things over my life, and I have, over the last 10, 15 years, come to the conclusion that was a big mistake. So this is my apology. As Mike said, programming languages are artifacts that we in Popple usually complain about, because we don't like Python, we don't like JavaScript, we hate the people who designed this thing. We don't hate them, we think that they make mistakes, big mistakes, and they're piled up, and then we complain more, instead of actually doing the stuff that we should be doing. Namely, thinking about programming languages. What does thinking about programming languages involve? Well, because we can prove things, we're mathematically trained people, we prove things. PoppleMike has reinforced that. We prove more things now that we've 25% mechanized proof things in Popple submissions. But programming languages should be evaluated. One of the things we evaluate is correctness. And we do this with theorems, because that's what we can do. Another thing we can do, we can evaluate performance. And we have benchmark suites that we do. I built a big one, and other people have built a big one, and we use them, and that's easy. All of them are easy to do. Now, it's easy in the sense that we can look at the paper and we know that this is a good way of proving things, it's a good way of measuring things. Programming languages are used by human beings. There's the expressive power. It can be easily expressive. For example, when Benjamin brought up that we should change the specs in the middle, I proposed this as an idea for a competition how easy can the language accommodate changes, and Robbie implemented in his ICFP competition years and years ago. Another idea is how easily can people approach programming languages. I routinely ask my students to write papers about that. Memos, one-page memo, why do you choose Python, whatever. Right? And the answers are unbelievably silly and shallow. Right? Why don't we value that instead of complaining about Python and JavaScript and whatever we complain about? So I think that PuppleMark has continued to reinforce this idea that we suck the lifeblood out of programming languages and focus on what we can do, prove theorems. But that's my philosophical remark, and I challenge you to tell me I'm wrong. I'm still allowed to be in the room after the questions.
Anyone like to comment?
He's never wrong. I'll just start with that. You know. I think that one gap, though, that is there in the way this is expressed is that we look at evaluation, performance, or we look at proving things, and then everyone's natural instinct is to say, well, the third thing is clearly human-centered design, and we have to get some humans and watch what they do and somehow set up a study where we're looking at, right, and then this typically gets instantiated with 10 undergraduates from the intro programming class that you happen to be teaching that quarter. And what I want to say is that, in fact, I think there's a large realm of possibility, and what Matthias is asking for is level n+1, and that we need to really be working level n, which is how can we even start to think about evaluation questions that aren't just these three categories of evaluation. And I think that there's a lot of possibility there, and at the risk of self-promotion, check out Lucas's talk coming up at Popple as one instance of that, to sort of maybe, I don't know, spark some creativity or something in your way of thinking about how you can evaluate the design of a programming language without being one of the kind of standard three things that we look at for evaluating there's a lot of space of possibility for evaluating designs of programming languages, and proof of assistance or whatever we're talking about here today. This was a larger comment about how the PuppleMark has pushed us in a certain direction, and I just want to, 2 more cents.
You're wrong. It's really a false dichotomy. So, a false dichotomy. So, I would agree that if only we knew how, maybe you do, I don't, evaluating the human usability of programming languages in better ways is an important thing. But one of the ways that practical programming language designs fail is by being insanely complicated in a bazillion corner cases. And that arises from human, but it's not necessarily a good thing. That arises partly because they're designed by implementation. One of the advantages of actual full-scale semantics is that it provides a pushback and a way that one can recognize that there is some crazy detailed mistake, there is some lack of uniformity, there is a bizarre special case for this, which might arise perfectly naturally when you're designing by implementation. But if you compel yourself to write down the semantics and test that against implementation, you see that, it's in your face. So the pushback against gratuitous complexity is something that is very hard to get, and this kind of thing offers that.
I'm going to give everybody else a chance to say something first, if they would like to.
So I think it's worthwhile thinking about some of the success stories, that have influenced programming language design. So let's say polymorphism. Okay, the first paper about polymorphism by John Reynolds, hugely impactful on language design, how we use programming languages. Abstract data types, Barbara Lischkoff's work, very influential on, I think everybody here in this room believes these were innovations that helped us to enforce certain abstractions, write programs more compactly. Although, you know, I don't know of any empirical study that would have shown, certainly not in the 70s, have shown, you know, that yes, this will have a huge impact on how we're writing programs. So while I think, yes, you know, it's useful to think about the human and how humans use these programs, I think there are innovations that come out of theoretical study of problems that have a real practical impact, but that might take some time.
Are we continuing the same conversation, or are we shifting to a new one?
I'm going to, in the danger of letting the panel completely derail, I'm going to pretend that we're just going to ask Kat the next question.
That does not comport with my intention. I suppose I should just start by saying I have no business being here. I'm not a practitioner in your field. My background is in computer security. That's why I'm here. I just wanted to offer two thoughts. One, the only reason I'm here is because of a guy who's sitting over there at the end who wrote Types and Programming Languages, which I read a long time ago as a math student. And then two, wherever Adam is, his books, they got me here. So on the human-centered design side, big fan of that kind of work in a general matter. I've funded projects in that class in the past. It's a wonderful thing. But I will also say this. Having been in computer security for nearly 20 years, I have met very few engineers who know how to design a system about which any desirable theorems are true. So, I would like to submit that while it is the case that perhaps the natural discipline of the people in here is to prove theorems, I think it would be very good if we kept going on with that and perhaps drew more people into that as a major mission. Thank you.
Amen to that.
Can't disagree with that. Especially with an online banking system I happen to use.
Well, first, thanks to all of the panelists for an enlightening conversation so far. So I guess my question's about education, especially the education of, just to frame it for now, the education of, say, graduate students. So now a lot of students are coming up, and their experience learning about how to reason about systems is often within the context of this, of these particular theorem provers like Coq, whereas in the past, I guess people had to kind of fight through working through things on paper or using particular, big step, small step, reduction semantics, things like that. And I was wondering if you could comment on, and I know, I think years ago Benjamin wrote a position piece like Lambda the Ultimate TA, which I read as a graduate student, and I thought was really interesting. And I was wondering if you could comment on kind of the effect of Poppelmark bringing theorem proving into the mainstream and its effect on education of, say, PL researchers.
Well, maybe I'm a self-selected group, or my students are already a bit self-selected, but yeah, I think there's a lot of interest towards theorem provers or languages like Agda that give you power of theorem proving while programming. And I think one particularly positive aspect that I've seen, so I mentioned that this morning at the mentoring workshop, but I will mention it again, is that it gives a second chance to students who are not very confident in their ability to do mathematical proofs. Okay, students who really are kind of too shy to ask for help or too afraid of being judged or whatever. When you put them in front of a theorem prover, interactive theorem prover, it is very reassuring. Okay? The system will say yes or it will say no, but it doesn't judge. It never gets tired, never gets angry. Like an advisor, and so and I've had several students who I think would never have done any kind of mathematical proofs without a proof assistant, and I think that's good. Sure.
See, I thought the prover was always angry.
It doesn't matter. Its mood doesn't matter.
I actually want to somewhat echo what Matthias was saying, and I agree with what you're saying about helping the students with mathematical ability, but if you're thinking about teaching students programming languages, and in particular, so I do think that proving theorems about our meta theory is a worthwhile endeavor, but it is a niche endeavor, right? It's not even every POPL paper has some sort of meta-theoretic theorem in it, right? And so what you're doing when you're teaching the student how to do programming languages using Coq or whatever theorem prover, they're getting really good at doing proof by induction, but is that really what you want to be spending your time teaching them? You're paying a big cost. You're saying, we're going to spend a lot of time on mechanization, a lot of time on learning induction, and what we're not going to have time to do is to look at and think about how to reason about a lot of different programming language features. Right? You don't have as much time to sort of compare the design of this and that and the other. Think about why is that design implemented like that if what you're doing is more type soundness proofs for sort of this, that, or the other. So it's tricky. A lot depends on what you're trying to teach your students.
So I'm a big fan of teaching using proof assistants.
Really?
Yes. But
You wrote the book on that.
that's true. But over the years, I've learned what the limits are, and there are some downsides. And I think the two principal downsides I would say like this. One is there is a huge difference between a proof whose purpose is to establish that something is true and a proof whose purpose is to communicate an idea. And proof assistants are really great for teaching the former, and they're somewhat great for helping a little bit with teaching the latter, but they very definitely do not get you all the way there. So that's one issue. The other issue is, imagine you were taking an operating system course, and the instructor insisted on showing you every concept written out in full detail in x86 assembly language. How far would you get? And the answer is further than you would think.
Okay, we have time for one more question from someone who hasn't asked a question yet. Unless there isn't such a person. There is one.
That's all.
So you spoke a bit about the things in POPLMark that didn't get all the way there, the parts that were sort of left unfinished. To what extent do you think it's valuable for people to keep putting energy into those things, and to what extent might those have just been questions that we don't care as much about the answer to, or other, something else?
They are the most important things. We messed up. Everybody messed up.
Well, if we're talking about part 3, the animating the semantics part, it felt a little weird at the end because, well, I read it as just, well, write an executable form of your reduction semantics, which was a much simpler exercise than the first part. It's like, you know, please prove Fermat's last theorem. And yeah, and when you've done that, prove the small theorem as well. So I guess that's one of the reasons why it was a little bit overlooked. Maybe it would have been better at the beginning. I mean, because animating semantics, for instance, is good for debugging them and finding errors and you know, getting familiar with it. It's not something that you do at the very end. And had we all tested our semantics at the beginning, I mean, one of the solutions gets the semantics wrong. Okay, one of the solutions has call by name instead of call by value, which doesn't matter for the soundness proof. Okay, but still, so yeah, maybe it was just a question of order. I mean, of questions, starting with something a little simpler, which is test some of your definitions, and then let's do proofs.
Okay, time for one last question.
So at the beginning of the panel, you were discussing what the next POPLMark challenge might look like. Do you really think you need a new POPLMark challenge? Or do you think, I mean, my perspective is that the original POPLMark challenge was sort of, it piqued everyone's curiosity. It got people interested in the idea of using proof assistants for programming languages. But as was discussed, it was a small problem that people could sort of tackle without it taking over their lives. But now, people are using proof assistants to do big things already. So, and they're pushing the boundaries of proof assistants in order to get anything done. So do you actually think a new challenge is necessary, or will it just continue evolving? Will the state of the art in proof assistants just evolve naturally based on necessity?
So I think there are still a lot of people who are proposing libraries or code generation frameworks or new extensions to proof assistance, new theories, and I think for that domain, that part, right, I think it is important to have sort of measure what is the state of the art we're at now and what we can do, and when you're proposing new libraries, then or new extensions or domain-specific languages, whatever, then we should at least be able to do a certain baseline. I don't think if, for people who are tackling proving realistic systems, like your work on Rust or DeepSpec, I think for them, I think these benchmarks don't maybe matter as much because they're not used to evaluate whether they can do this big system or not. But I think there is a desire to develop new theories as well as new libraries and tool support, and for that it would matter to have, I think, benchmarks.
And I'm not sure if I'm maybe saying the same thing that Brigitte was, but it's a very good point, Derek. But I want to point out that benchmarks serve another role in that they become the kind of this driver to make communities make significant improvements. And so for like the two that I've mentioned so far have been TPTP and DeCapo, and huge improvements in the garbage collection technology just by the existence of this benchmark that everybody was like, oh yeah, I better mentor against that thing. And the same thing with I mean, it's amazing the SMT, like things they can do now. It's, because of this, years of everybody, if you get 10% improvement every year, like that's like, we're all familiar with the stock market, right? These improvements can be significant and can be real drivers. So maybe it doesn't play the same role necessarily, but there's definitely a role for things like that, in my opinion.
So, if I thought it was feasible to have a comparable scale-based challenge, then I think that would be great. Sadly, I don't think it's really feasible, but I think it is important to sort of pose that challenge sort of explicitly to notice what we have failed to do, and then maybe some group or groups will take that up in different contexts and produce not entirely comparable things that we will learn from nonetheless.
You're going to be fast? No. Are you going to be nice?
The answer to the second was always no, right? Let me propose a challenge, because I really like what Peter has done, for example, for TCP, and what the ACL2 group has done for AMD's coprocessors. They don't generate a new compiler and say, I generated from proof that was correct. They take an actual existing artifact. They run the program, the ACL2 as a program, through the benchmark, the entire benchmark suite. It's fast enough, the proof thing is fast enough to run the entire benchmark suite for the coprocessor, and then the proof theorems about it. Can you pick any existing programming language, any existing like ML, SML, or Camel,
JavaScript.
Maybe not. Rust, and apply your theorem proving techniques to that thing about a particular meta theorem. For example, just memory safety. It doesn't crash by pointer something going wrong, right? Just that. And also run your theorem proving technology through all the benchmarks and all the tests that this programming language community has put up. Like Bracket has 40,000 tests. First do the tests and then prove something. Was it short enough?
Yes. Okay, I'm going to let that linger. So we're getting to the end.
Good challenge.
Thank you for that. I think it's great. Now I want to give all the panelists a chance to have a takeaway. So clear your minds, everyone. Clear your minds. Think good thoughts. And inspiring takeaways. So if you think about POPLMark, about the state of proof assistance, using them to mechanize programming languages, to evaluate programming languages, anything that you think the last 15 years has taught us and what we should be looking forward to for the next 15 years. Summing up the panel, what is your takeaway? Go.
So I guess is the question going what we wish in 15 years?
The question is, what is your takeaway message from PoppleMark past and future?
I'll pass that.
Well, I don't know if I have an answer to that question, but I do have a wish. And that wish is that in the future, before I did any sort of big development that was going to need a theorem proved, if I could somehow know beforehand whether it's going to be more painful to mechanize the thing or more painful to write the 100-page appendix. If I could answer that question before I started, that would be enough for me. I would be happy.
That's an excellent takeaway. Thank you.
Okay, well, for me, the answer is I will mechanize now. I mean, I will no longer ever write a 100-page technical appendix to a paper. So I think this is one of the victories of the PoppleMark effort. Okay, we are down with those stupid appendices. Okay. And that's already great. So yeah, well, I'm quite happy about the outcome of PoppleMark. So first, because of all the popularity it gave to interactive theorem proving in this community, and maybe in some others, and also because I wouldn't have guessed that it would generate so much excitement and even controversy as we have today. I mean, would you have imagined that the soundness proof of FSUB would ever get so many people excited and all working late at night and so on? So I think this is already a success. I mean, just a collective excitement and enthusiasm, and well, I hope we can keep that going. So, yeah, trying to mechanize big existing artifacts is one direction. I think at some point you're just exhausting you're just wasting your efforts. Okay, at some point you need also. I mean, it would have been impossible for me to prove GCC correct because GCC is too big and GCC has never been designed with a proof in mind. So writing my own compiler was the right thing to do, and I would encourage everyone to maybe stop trying to mechanize big things from the real world and try to think of better things that are mechanized from the beginning, maybe smaller but more rigorous, and using mechanization also as a design guide and not just as a verification a posteriori. That would be my message.
What just Xavier said, that's my takeaway.
I think I gave mine earlier, actually, in the middle when I first spoke. That I view PoppleMark as one slice of what it means to make our papers more correct, and that's valuable insofar as it makes us better communicators with others. And I would say it's a terrible shame that the programming languages community, the set of programming languages that we use when we produce our papers, is really not good. Okay? We can do better with tool support for programming language for our papers, and that's how I see PoppleMark as showing us an important step forward, and there's a lot more ground there.
So, from the last 15 years, I think we have learned that it is perfectly possible to mechanize substantial meta theory, and quite often, although not always, that'll be the right thing to do. But 15 years from now, I would hope that we're in a position where both existing large artifacts and new languages are designed and implemented using these techniques in an entirely integrated way. And there are quite a lot of things missing in the current state of the art, which I would encourage all of you to think about.
So I can't resist putting in a little plug for testing. I think
put a big one in.
Or a big one.
Yeah, a bigger one.
Okay. I think the prevalence now of or almost ubiquity of proof assistants and the ideas around them and the rigor that they imply in a certain part of the PL community is great. And it's a small community with maybe a predisposition to like that kind of thing. So one question that's always in my mind is how do we spread it further? How do we spread the rigor of the way that we approach ideas to a broader community of people? And I think one super important way to do that is to blur the distinction between writing down tests, which could be called specifications, and the distinction between validating our artifacts against those tests, of which a particular example is proving. So just thinking a little bit beyond just proof assistance and QED, I think the impact of the kind of rigor that we deal with could be much broader and will be much broader in thinking about it in a little bit more flexible way. And then the other takeaway, I think, is the fantastic mixing of communities that's happened over the past couple of decades. It's something that I'm really happy about, and that, again, probably would have happened anyway, but I feel like the POPLMark effort helped speed it up, and I'm super happy about that.
And on that note, I'd really like to thank all of the panelists, and I hope you will join me for their wonderful insights.
We should also thank Mike for being an excellent moderator. We should particularly thank Talia,
Yes.
without whom this panel wouldn't have happened.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it.